They buried him in silence, but the sound of iron shackles did not fade with the soil. At night the fields still ring with the metallic scrape of chains dragged across earth. The night in Virginia did not forgive. It clung to the earth like a shroud, and whispered through the cane fields, as though every stalk carried memory of suffering. On nights when the moon sank low and the stars hid their faces, the ground itself seemed to tremble with remembrance. They said his name had been struck from the records, that no ledger bore his entry, and no master dared speak of him. But the soil remembered, the trees remembered, and the chains most of all. They buried him, without prayer, without even the false comforts of Scripture that were often weaponized to keep the enslaved silent. They dragged his broken body across the fields he once toiled in, and lowered him into the dirt as though he were nothing but refuse. Yet when the last shovel struck the earth, the silence cracked. Not outwardly, not in sound that human ears could easily measure, but deep beneath the ground a vibration lingered. A scrape, a rattle, a chain that moved, though no hand commanded it. The field hands spoke of it in whispers when overseers slept heavy from drink. They said, if you stood near the unmarked ground when night fell, you could hear the dragging of iron cuffs across the soil, as though someone walked just beneath the surface. One voice swore that when he leaned down to listen, he heard breath, labored and harsh, choking on the dirt of burial. Another claimed that he saw the soil ripple like water, as though something chained beneath had tried to rise. The masters dismissed these tales as foolishness born of superstition. Yet even they began to notice the unease. Cattle would not graze near that patch of land. Dogs bristled with fur raised and teeth bared, though no figure was there. Children were warned not to wander close, and mothers clutched them tighter when the night wind rose carrying the faintest metallic scrape. On one particular night, the kind of night when the moon refused to rise, a field hand named Isaiah swore the sound grew louder than ever before. He had stayed late tending to the last of the tobacco rows when he heard it, the unmistakable drag of iron on stone, not from afar but close, too close. Lord keep me, he whispered, though the words trembled like leaves in storm. The sound circled him, a slow grinding as though shackles were being pulled in a great arc around his body. When he turned, he saw nothing but the dim line of trees and the darkness between them. But the air thickened, heavy like breath pressing against his neck. That night he ran. He ran past the cabins, past the master's house, past the well, until his chest burned and his legs buckled. When others asked why his hands were bloodied, he could not explain. Only that he felt cold iron graze his wrists, though nothing had touched him, and so the story spread. The man they buried in silence had not been silenced. His chains rang louder than sermons, louder than hymns, louder than any whip could command. Some said the sound was vengeance, others said it was sorrow. But all agreed on one thing. If you heard the echo of iron dragging across earth, you must not answer, for those who answered never woke the next morning. Still, the sound persists. On moonless nights the fields become a chamber of echoes, metal against stone, iron against root, dragging, scraping, circling. The overseers began to hear it too, though they never admitted aloud. One was found pale at dawn, his lips blue, his eyes open wide as though he had stared into something too heavy to bear. His hand gripped his chest, but upon his wrist was the faint impression of a shackle pressed deep into flesh. The chains did not fade with soil. They did not rust nor break, they echoed, louder each season, until the land itself seemed bound by them. And though no grave bore a name, the story carved its own. A curse whispered through every stalk of cane, every row of tobacco, every stone that lined the road leading away from the plantation. The dead man did not rest. The dead man walked with chains still locked, and every step he took dragged the weight of silence with him. The night ends only with the question, whose door will he circle next, whose breath will falter when iron brushes against the floorboards, and whose heart will stop when the last echo fades into dawn. No headstone bore his name, yet the ground never forgot where his body was thrown. The earth itself seemed restless, refusing to lie still above him. There are graves that beg to be remembered, graves that sing in Hymns and cradle the dead with dignity, but there are others. Pits dug in haste, filled with shame, where the soil swallows a man whole and yet cannot contain him. The plantation kept such a pit, not marked by stone nor cross, not sanctified by prayer, but left as raw earth at the edge of the woods, a place where the ground sank ever so slightly, as if bowing under the weight of memory it could not forget. They whispered that more than one body lay in that hollow, that when the overseers tired of punishment and death, when blood pooled too thick in the fields, they dug no graves at all. They cast the dead into the pit, like unwanted husks. Turning their eyes from the sight, the land was made into a silent accomplice, but the land did not. Forgive field hands swore the earth there moved even when the wind was still. They said if you pressed your hand to the soil, you would feel a tremor beneath. Not unlike the slow rhythm of breath, one boy dared to test it. His palm pressed flat into the dirt under the cruel dare of his companions. He ripped his hand back, screaming, though no one else had felt it. When they pried open his fingers, they saw the mark, a wet smear of clay shaped like a print of another hand, as though someone beneath had grasped him. The pit grew restless with every season. Rain refused to settle in it. Water beaded on its surface before sliding away, as though the earth itself spat out any attempt to soften it. Crops planted nearby withered, their roots shriveling as if they had reached down and touched something unspeakable. The masters ignored it at first, but unease crept even into their voices. One plantation wife remarked that the ground looked swollen, like a belly stretched too tight. Her words were hushed. But others had seen it too, the earth rising ever so slightly at night, then sinking by dawn as though something inside shifted, straining against its prison. It was on one such night that a lantern was carried too close. A guard pacing the edge of the property had wandered near the pit. Those awake in the cabins said they saw him pause, tilt his head and lean forward. The flame flickered. His body bent low, and then a sound like 1,000 whispers rose from the soil, not voices, but the hiss of roots breaking, of stone grinding, of earth that would not be still. The guard's scream carried across the fields by the time others arrived. His lantern lay broken, the flames smothered in mud, and the man himself was gone. No trace, only the ground disturbed, as if it had swallowed him whole from then on. No one dared walk near it. Children were warned with sharp hands and sharper eyes. Even the dogs kept distance, circling wide with tails between their legs, but avoidance did not end the unrest. Each harvest the pit seemed to draw closer, the soil creeping outward, the earth cracking, trees around it leaning unnaturally as though bowing to something unseen. The pit was not still. It was hungry Isaiah, who had once heard the echo of chains, swore that at night he could see faint movement in the dirt, not wind, not animals, but the soil shifting in waves, like the slow breathing of a body beneath a sheet. He told no one at first, fearing madness, until one night he woke to find clay beneath his fingernails and the taste of earth in his mouth, as if in his sleep he had been summoned. Drawn to the pit without memory of walking, others soon confessed the same dreams of suffocation, dreams of hands pulling them downward into soil that pressed tight against chest and throat. And each morning, a mud tracked across their cabin floors. Though none remembered leaving their beds, the elders murmured that the pit was a wound that could not close, that the nameless buried there had made covenant with the earth itself, binding their unrest to root and stone. The masters tried to cover it, piling timber and rock, but the ground rejected the weight, splitting wide until the wood collapsed inward and the rocks tumbled into the hollow as if fed to it. By the time autumn came, no one would walk within sight of it, yet the sound travelled, soft, patient rhythmic, a scrape from beneath, a stirring, as though chains dragged across buried stone, and the faintest whisper of breath rising from the soil. Then came the night when the pit exhaled. The wind carried with it the stench of rot, not the rot of one body, but of many layered and tangled through time. It seeped into the cabins, into the master's house, into every crevice of the plantation until sleep was impossible. The children cried, the mothers prayed, and the men sat wide-eyed in silence, knowing no prayer could smother what stirred. Morning revealed nothing but earth, silent, still as though mocking those who had heard its breath. Yet when the sun climbed high, something caught the light bone not whole, but fragments scattered across the edge of the hollow, a rib here, a jaw there clawing. their way up through the dirt, as if the pit itself had decided to remind the living what they had tried to bury. And though the masters ordered the bones gathered and hidden, no one forgot what they had seen. The earth had spoken, and its language was bone. That night the pit waited again. The soil sagged lower than before, its darkness yawning wide, as though it prepared to swallow more, the last words spoken in fear before sleep carried across the cabins. If the ground is restless, then it is not finished with us yet. And as the night deepened, the pit shifted, wider, darker, waiting for the next soul to stumble too close. A faint glow wandered through the plantation, long after the overseers slept. Those who followed swore they saw a figure walking barefoot, where no man should rise. The nights were cruel enough without light. The cabins lay in silence. The fields stretched endless beneath the stars, and the forest beyond seemed to breathe with secrets too old for men. Yet every so often, when the air grew damp and the owls stilled, a glow appeared, faint, wandering, shifting where no flame should be. At first they thought it was a guard's lantern, a drunk man stumbling too late from his post, but the light moved strangely, not steady, not with the pace of footsteps, but in slow arcs, as if carried by an arm that swayed against its will. Isaiah was the first to speak of it openly. He whispered of a figure walking barefoot across the rows of cane long after midnight, a shadow barely human, its head bowed, the lantern swinging low enough that its flame licked the ground. He swore the light did not dim when the wind blew, that it burned without smoke, without fuel, without sound. The others hushed him, for words gave power to what should have remained unspoken. But silence did not stop the glow from returning, night after night. The faint light drifted past the cabins, sometimes far, sometimes so close that its glow brushed against the walls, casting shadows of thin fingers through the cracks in the wood. The children hid their faces, the mothers hummed low prayers, the men clenched their fists, though they dared not rise, for no one wished to see what walked with that lantern. Still, curiosity is a curse sharper than any chain. One night, 3 men followed it, slipping from their cabin in silence, their feet pressing soft against the dirt. The glow moved steadily toward the fields, and they trailed behind, careful to stay far enough that they would not be seen. But the figure never turned, never faltered. Its bare feet left no mark in the soil, no sound against the earth. And when the men dared to creep closer, one whispered, "It carries no flame indeed." When their eyes adjusted, they saw it clearly. The lantern's glass was cracked, its wick long gone, and yet the light burned within, cold and pale, like the glow of bone under moonlight. The figure slowed. The men held their breath, and then it stopped, the lantern swinging still, its glow spilling across the dirt rows of the field. One of the men, Samuel, leaned forward, straining to see the face of what carried it. What he saw hollowed his voice forever. No skin, no eyes, no lips moved upon that head, only bone, the skull grinning through the faint shimmer of flesh that clung in tatters. The lantern hung from its wrist, not by grip, but by a rusted shackle, the chain looped through the handle as though it had been bound to it in death. Samuel fled that night. He returned screaming, waking the cabins, but when others rushed to see, there was no light, no figure, only the rows of cane swaying under a windless sky. The other 2 men never came back from then on. No one questioned what the lantern was. It was not a guard, it was not a man, it was a reminder that those who had been buried without justice walked still, bound to their suffering, carrying lights that led the living astray. Some nights the glow lingered longer than before. It would weave between the cabins, pausing at doorways as though seeking someone once. A child woke screaming that the lantern had stopped outside her bed, its pale glow filling the cracks in the wall. Her mother hushed her with trembling hands, but in the morning they found ash scattered on the floorboards where the glow had been. The masters grew uneasy too, though they cloaked their fear with anger. One ordered the pit sealed with stone, believing the wandering light to be a trick of restless spirits. But when the stones were laid, the lantern returned brighter, as though mocking the attempt. The overseer who had overseen the sealing was found dead the next morning. His eyes burned white, his fingers curled as if clutching a flame no one else could see by autumn. The lantern's path grew predictable. It rose from the far side of the pit, drifted through the fields, circled the cabins, and returned again before dawn. Those who dared watch swore that behind the glow followed faint shadows, shapes too many to count, their outlines shifting like smoke trailing after fire. Isaiah, who had once heard the chains, said he believed the lantern was not meant to frighten them, but to call that light ain't ours, he whispered to a small gathering one night. It belongs to them still walking, the ones who ain't gone quiet. Every step it takes is a summons, every glow a call-in. One day it won't just wander. One day it'll stop, and whoever it stops for, that'll be the end. His words curdled the air with silence. No one wished to believe him. Yet no one could deny the truth of what their eyes had seen, and so the nights continued. The fields swayed, though no wind stirred. The cabins rattled, though no hand touched them. And always that faint light wandered, barefoot, bone-faced, lantern-bound to chain one night, long after midnight. Isaiah woke to the sound of breath not his own. The cabin was still, the others asleep. Yet through the cracks of the wall a pale light seeped in. Washing across his cot, the lantern had stopped. Its glow lingered, unmoving, breathing against the wood as if waiting. Isaiah did not move, he did not breathe. And when the light finally faded, retreating into the fields, he lay still until dawn. Certain he had been chosen, but spared for reasons he dared not name. But the two empty cots from before remained untouched, and their absence, like the glow, whispered that the lantern would always return, until no living soul remained. In the master's house, they heard breathing that did not belong to the living. Boards swelled and groaned, as though lungs rose and fell beneath their feet. The house stood tall against the horizon, its white-painted walls gleaming by day, its windows glaring like hollow eyes by night. It was built on cruelty, every brick set with stolen labor, every nail hammered through blistered hands, and though the masters thought themselves safe behind its doors, the house itself had learned to breathe. At first it was dismissed as settling wood, old boards groaning with age, beams shifting against one another in the deep silence of night. But those who scrubbed the floors, who carried trays through its halls, began to whisper that it was not the groan of wood they heard. It was the sound of lungs, a long inhale swelling beneath their feet, followed by a slow exhale through cracks in the foundation. One maid swore she felt warmth rise through the boards as she knelt, her rag pausing mid-scrub, not heat from the hearth but warmth like breath, humid and alive, pressing against her palms. She fled the room, her rag abandoned, her whispers trembling in the cabins later that night. "They ain't gone," she said. "They're down there still, breathing under us." The masters laughed at her fear, but their laughter faltered when they too heard the sound, soft at first, then louder, until it seemed the very house sighed beneath their feet at night. When candles burned low, the floors swelled upward, boards lifting as if lungs expanded below. And when silence stretched too long, the air would rush out in one low moan, rattling dishes, stirring curtains, sending every soul awake. Soon none could deny it. The house breathed, children grew sick within its walls, their small chests rising in rhythm, not with their own lungs but with the heavy pull beneath the floor. One girl whispered in fever that she felt hands beneath her bed, hands pressing upward, as though trying to lift her through the boards. She died before dawn, her body limp, her face pale as though the breath had been drawn from her. By then even the masters' voices carried unease. The overseer, drunk on false courage, declared he would prove the floor hollow. He pried up the boards in the dining hall before a gathering of servants and family alike. The air rushed up when he opened it, damp, foul, carrying the stench of rot long buried. Those nearest gagged, their eyes watering, while the overseer sneered and leaned low with his lantern. The pit beneath was shallow, yet shadows moved within it, not rats, not roots, but shifting shapes that clung to the earth, pressing upward, pulling back, pressing again as though caught between worlds. One shape pressed too close, and the overseer swore he felt breath on his cheek, wet. Hot, alive, he slammed the boards shut, nailing them back with shaking hands. Though his mouth barked curses of denial from that night on, the breathing grew louder. It echoed through the halls like a hidden congregation sighing in unison. Visitors from other plantations left early, unable to sleep with the sound of lungs beneath their beds. Servants crossed themselves, murmuring prayers, though none dared leave, for the house would not let them. Those who tried woke the next morning inside again, their memories fractured, their clothes dirtied with soil that had no place on their paths. Isaiah, haunted already by chains and lanterns, swore the breathing belonged to those cast into the unmarked pit. "That house sitting on their chest," he whispered. "Every plank nailed above their bodies, every brick weight on their lungs. They ain't restin'. They trying to breathe through us." The others listened but dared not agree aloud. For in the dead of night, when the house sighed deepest, voices slipped through the exhale. Not full words, only fragments, wet and broken, like whispers through drowning throats down here, cold still. "Help me." The whispers came from beneath the children's beds, beneath the master's table, beneath the floor where the piano sat untouched. Each room carried its own voice, as if every plank remembered a different soul crushed under its weight. One night, the master himself woke to the sound of breath at his ear, not beside him, not above him, but rising through the pillow from beneath the bed. He struck the candle alight, his eyes darting, but no one was there, only the soft swell of mattress as though something pressed upward from below. His wife wept when he told her, though he forbade her from speaking it again. But both knew the truth. The house that once held their power now held something else, something that did not obey as winter crept in. Frost lined the windows, but the floors remained warm, too warm like the heat of a living body pressed just beneath the boards, and when snow fell thick across the land, melting everywhere except the soil beneath the house. They knew the ground would not claim its dead until vengeance was drawn. The final night of that season, the breathing grew unbearable. Every wall quivered, every dish shook, every candle guttered in rhythm with the inhale and exhale of lungs, too massive to be hidden. The servants huddled in the cabins, the masters clutched pistols in their trembling hands, and all listened to the house groan like a chest breaking open. Then the floorboards cracked, a sound like ribs splitting echoed through the halls as one plank after another bent and lifted. Hands, pale, wet, long-boned, pushed upward through the gaps, groping for air, clawing for release, and from beneath came a sigh not of sorrow but of hunger. The house was breathing no longer. It was waking. It was waking. That dawn the whip cracked through empty air, striking shadows that winced and bled. The overseer's arm trembled, for he had not lifted it. Dawn came slow on the plantation, a pale grey light spreading across the fields, like a reluctant blessing for the enslaved. Morning meant the hiss of rope, the bark of orders, the crack of the overseer's whip. It was a sound that stitched itself into bone, sharp enough to make the strongest spine bow, sharp enough to turn silence into dread. But one morning, the whip struck when no hand held it. The overseer, a man swollen with cruelty, was the first to hear it. He had not yet risen from his chair when the air outside split with a shrill whistle. A crack followed, sharp, merciless, echoing through the cane fields. He lurched to his feet, muttering curses, believing some hand dared mock his authority. But when he stumbled outside, whip still hanging untouched by his bed, the sound rang again, not near. But everywhere the air itself bent with it. The field hands froze. Some dropped their tools. Others clutched at their ears. For though no lash touched them, welts rose fresh on their skin as if struck by invisible cords. Blood beaded at their backs, their arms, their shoulders. Children cried out without knowing why, flinching from blows they could not see. The overseer shouted until his voice cracked, demanding to know who dared. But his words broke when the whip cracked again, this time within the very yard where he stood. The dirt at his feet split open in a clean line, as though something sharp had torn across it. And when he lifted his eyes, he saw it, the whip itself rising from where it lay coiled, slithering through the dust like a serpent roused from sleep. Its leather gleamed though no hand guided it. The wooden handle trembled, rattling against the ground, then lifted as if gripped by some unseen fist. The overseer staggered back, his knees weak, as the whip snapped through the air once more, striking the shadow cast by his own body. He screamed when pain bloomed across his chest, a welt tearing into flesh, though no leather touched him from that morning forward. The whip became its own master. It hung on no wall, it obeyed no hand. At dawn it whistled through the air, striking the fields, the cabins, the very walls of the house, and always, those near enough bore the wounds. The field hands whispered of curses, of spirits too restless to lie still. Isaiah said it was not a curse but a judgment. The lash turned against those who once commanded it, but judgment fell on all alike. The whip struck man and woman. Child and overseer, bound and free, no flesh was spared. And in the silence after each strike, A faint voice lingered, low, breathless, carried on the air, "Remember me." The overseer tried to end it. He seized the whip one night, nails digging into the leather, and hurled it into the fire. The flames swallowed it whole, spitting sparks that clawed the air. He laughed then, wild and shaking, certain he had defeated what haunted him. But at dawn, when the fields lay pale under mist, the whistle came again, and there it was, Holto gleaming, coiled at the cabin doors as though it had crawled from ash to find its place once more. Fear spread quicker than fever. The field hands worked with eyes to the sky, waiting for the sound that split their mornings. Mothers shielded their children with bodies. Though the lash struck through flesh and bone alike, the masters grew pale, walking their halls with shoulders hunched, dreading the dawn, for even they were not spared. One woman woke screaming with her back torn open. Though she had never stepped foot into the fields, the whip belonged to no man now, it belonged to the dead Isaiah. Restless and drawn by truths others dared not voice, stayed awake one night to watch it. He swore the whip did not move alone but was led, that in the faint shimmer of moonlight he saw figures walking beside it, shadows without bodies, faces without skin, chains dragging where feet should fall. The whip cracked in rhythm with their steps, striking the earth in time with the march of the forgotten. Each crack was a voice, each welt a memory carved into flesh, so that the living would not forget what the masters had tried to bury one dawn. The overseer who had once burned the whip was found dead in the yard. His body sprawled across the dirt. His hands locked tight around his throat, but no rope bound him, only long, dark welts that wrapped his neck like a second skin, marks of a lash that had never loosened. His eyes were wide, his tongue swollen, his lips frozen in a rictus of terror. After that, no one dared touch the whip. It lay where it pleased, curling at thresholds, coiled in the fields, dragging faint lines in the dirt as though sketching words in a language too old to read. And every morning, without fail, it rose again, whistling through the air, striking shadows until blood wet the earth. But the worst was not the sound, nor the pain, nor the welts that never healed. The worst was the silence that followed the moment when the whip stilled, curling upon itself as though waiting. And in that silence, if you dared listen close, you could hear breath, not your own, but the breath of the ones who had felt its bite before you, whispers, layered over whispers, groans laid upon groans, a chorus of the forgotten carried by leather one morning. The whip lay still too long. The dawn stretched wide, the air heavy, and no crack split the sky. The field hands paused, afraid to move, afraid to hope. The overseers squinted at the horizon, muttering that the curse had passed. Then the whip rose higher than ever before. It snapped once, a crack like thunder splitting the heavens, and every bird in the trees fell silent, dropping from their branches with wings limp as though slain in air. The earth quivered, the cabins groaned, and the figure of the whip held its poise in the sky, like a banner lifted in war. Those who watched swore they saw more than shadows that day. They saw faces, whole faces, hundreds pressed in the air around it, each one scarred, each one broken, each one howling without sound. The whip cracked again, and the ground split, soil tearing open like flesh under blade, and then, upon silence, the whip coiled neatly at the center of the yard, waiting, patient, as though choosing its next master. Choosing its next master. They said the well was cursed before the first stone was laid around its mouth. They said the earth had refused to give clean water there, that something beneath was already awake and waiting. But the master demanded a well close to the house, so the enslaved were forced to dig, forced to cut deep into the soil, deeper than men should go, and when the water finally came, it was not the clean rush of spring, but a slow black seep, thick with mud, with veins of something that looked like rust, but smelled like iron blood. The well stood in the courtyard, a circle of stone that never seemed to stay dry. At dawn its rim sweated as though the night had bled upon it. By dusk the shadows around its lip grew heavier, pooling in ways that made no sense to the eye. Children whispered that they saw faces in its surface, not their own but strangers. And at night, when the moon struck it, there were always two pale glimmers below, not reflections of the stars, but eyes wide and unblinking. Staring up from the depths, the first to notice was a woman named Ruth. She went to draw water and came back pale, saying the rope had twisted itself around her hands as if pulled by something below. When she looked into the well, she saw a man's face staring back, not floating but fixed, As though the stone walls themselves had learned to wear skin, no one believed her at first. They mocked her, trembling, called it the madness of heat and labor. But then others went, sent by the master to prove her wrong, and they too came back shaken, their buckets still empty. Their lips cracked as if the well itself had stolen their thirst. The master grew furious. A well was money. It kept his house alive. His fields growing, his control unbroken, so he demanded his men drink from it. To shame the others into obedience, one by one they lowered the bucket, lifted it dripping with black water, and forced it to their mouths. But when the water touched their tongues, they spat it out. Gagging it was not just foul, it was wrong. The taste clung like iron filings. Sharp and metallic, the flavor of wounds that had never healed blood, one man whispered, wiping his lips with the back of his hand. And though the master struck him for speaking, everyone had already heard the word after that. The well was avoided. Men walked thirsty before they touched it again. Women went into the woods to gather water from muddy streams rather than dip their hands into its circle. But thirst is patient, cruel. And when the summer heat rose, when the creeks dried into trickles, they were forced to return. That is when the whispers began, not in their ears, but in the stone. When the bucket rope slid down, the air inside the well shivered with voices, faint and echoing, speaking in tongues no one wanted to remember. Some swore the voices called them by name, drawing them closer, urging them to lean in. And sometimes, too often, someone did, they leaned, peered into the depths, and the eyes below widened, bright as coins catching firelight. By morning they were gone. The water, though, always rose a little higher afterward, as if the well had been fed. Ruth was the first to connect the vanishings. She noticed that the soil around the courtyard had grown damp, though there had been no rain. She swore she saw handprints pressed in the mud beside the well, fingers too long, spread too wide, and once, when the night was quiet and the moon full, she swore she heard breathing not her own, not the living's, but something wet, rising and falling below her feet, as though lungs pressed against the stones of the well itself. She told no one at first, for fear they would laugh again, but silence did not protect her. For one evening, as she bent over the well to draw water, the rope snapped in her hands and the bucket fell away. She leaned too far, saw the eyes staring back, and this time, the face around them moved. The mouth opened wide, as if to drink her whole reflection. She screamed, staggered back, and swore that a wet hand had brushed her cheek before she escaped. The master ordered the well sealed after that, but the bricks they placed around its mouth never stayed by morning. The stones had crumbled as though something beneath had pushed them aside. They tried iron, tried wood, tried fire. Nothing lasted every night. The well breathed again, and the eyes returned by then. The household was restless. The enslaved refused to fetch water at all. The overseers muttered that they felt watched even when they slept, as though something from the depths had crawled into their dreams. And the master himself, proud and stubborn, began to waver. He would wake at night, drenched in sweat, swearing he heard chains scraping below the well. He swore the eyes were not strangers anymore. They were the eyes of men he had whipped, men he had buried in unmarked soil, men who now stared back with patient hunger. The last story told of the well was this: one night, after a week of drought, the master himself went down to draw water. The house was asleep, the moon bright. He lowered the rope, listening to the bucket splash, and when he pulled, it would not rise. He leaned, cursed, tugged, and then he froze because two pale hands, slick and long-fingered, reached up through the dark water and gripped the rope slowly. Hand over hand, they began to climb. The master's scream split the night, but by the time anyone reached the courtyard, the well was silent. The rope hung loose, wet and frayed, and the only thing at its mouth was a pool of water spreading outward, thick and red, as though the well had finally overflowed. They say the eyes still wait there. Staring upward, they say no one dares look long into the well. For if you see them, they will see you. And once they see you, the taste of iron will never leave your tongue. And sometimes, when the bucket rope creaks in the night, though no one pulls it, a voice rises, dripping from the stone, whispering in a tongue that is not dead, but buried, a voice that promises the well has not yet been fed enough. They came with laughter on their lips and greed in their eyes, new masters, strangers from distant counties, called by the promise of land fertile and rich. though whispers already clung to it like mildew on damp stone. They arrived with wagons heavy, wives veiled against the sun, children clutching dolls carved from bone-white wood, and yet none of them stayed long enough to see a season change. The first family carried the smell of polished silver and damp parchment, their voices sharp as quills. They stepped into the great house proud, dismissive of the sagging boards and crooked windows that night. The air grew thick in the rooms they slept in. The children woke crying, saying the floorboards pulsed like a heartbeat beneath their straw mattresses. By morning, the children were silent, their beds neatly folded, their dolls resting atop them with eyes turned inward, as though listening. The parents searched, screamed, tore the house apart, but the room smelled of nothing but soil, wet and clinging. As though a grave had been opened beneath the floor 3 days later, the husband was found wandering the courtyard, his mouth packed with dirt. The wife was never found at all. The second visitors were bolder, 3 brothers, hardened men with rough hands and louder laughter. They claimed they did not fear stories of whispers or wells. They carried knives at their belts and whiskey at their throats. But on their first night, the house turned against them. The shutters slammed though no wind stirred. The lanterns sputtered, and the stairs groaned as if bearing invisible weight. One of the brothers swore he saw shadows crowding the hall, men with bowed backs, wrists shackled, faces bruised and eyeless when he spat and cursed them. The shadows did not flee but pressed closer, pressing the air from his chest. By morning, 2 of the brothers were gone. The third sat at the kitchen table, rocking back and forth, mumbling, "They're still here." They never left until his voice cracked into silence. The land stood empty once more. The third family tried piety where others brought pride. They raised hymns in the parlor, knelt on splintered boards, begged heaven to bless their harvest. But their prayers were not answered with light. The house itself hummed during their songs, the beams rattling, the floor moaning beneath their knees. And when they rose to light candles, they found the flames bent low, as if bowing toward something in the soil that night. The matron swore she saw faces watching from the mirror, lips moving in time with her hymns, but in words that twisted her tongue into knots of fear within a week. The hymn books lay scattered in the dust. The family was gone, their wagon still tied outside with horses stamping in panic until their eyes rolled white. And so it went. Visitor after visitor, they arrived as masters and departed as whispers. The house devoured them, not with fang or flame, but with silence that pressed in like a coffin lid. Each room bore new stains, new smells, damp earth, iron rust, candle wax melted by unseen breath, and always the same refrain from the enslaved who still worked the fields. Bound by chains heavier than death itself, they never leave. For the truth was this: the house did not empty after each disappearance. It filled each visitor who vanished, did not depart into the woods, did not flee into the night. They stayed, absorbed into the walls, folded into the soil. Their laughter became the groaning of the rafters, their prayers became the creak of the floorboards, their breath became the draughts that shivered through locked windows. And at night, when the enslaved passed the house, they heard voices layered one atop another, not screams, not calls for help, but mutterings, restless conversations of those who could not leave, who pressed their faces against the glass in endless vigil. Ruth, who had seen the eyes in the well, was the first to understand. She stood one dusk by the field's edge, gazing at the house as its windows flickered without fire, its doors shifted without hands. She whispered, "They're gathering." And though the others hushed her, they too began to notice that the land grew heavier with each passing year, as though the weight of all those who had come, and all those who had not left, pressed down upon it one evening. When the cicadas shrieked, and the air carried the sour scent of storms, a wagon rolled up again. A man stepped down, proud and certain, claiming he had bought the land for himself. He scoffed at the stories, spat at the warnings, and by nightfall had lit his first candle in the master's chamber. But the enslaved, watching from their cabins, swore they saw more than one shadow moving behind the window glass. They swore they heard more than one voice chanting in that room. A chorus of greetings whispered in soil-thick tones, and when the candle went out, the windows stayed lit, not with flame, but with the faint, steady glow of eyes peering outward. Row upon row, never blinking. By morning, the wagons stood abandoned. The horses were gone, and in the yard, carved into the damp soil with unnatural precision, was a circle of footprints, too many to count, pressed deep as though a multitude had walked out from the house in the night and stood in silence, waiting for the next visitor who thought they might leave. They might leave. It began with a spark no larger than a moth's wing. Dry stalks whispered under summer heat, and the first tongues of flame rose slow, licking. Hungry, the master cursed the sky for its drought, blamed the hands that tilled his fields. But none dared whisper the truer fear, that the fire was not born of lightning or carelessness, but of the land itself breathing out its rage. The enslaved gathered at the edge of the fields, their faces lit in orange and red. The fire should have been brief, a flare and a fall, for the crops were green still with life, yet the flames did not fade, they climbed, higher and higher, clinging not to straw or husk but to the air itself, a wall of heat that bent the horizon, and in the heart of the blaze, some swore they saw shapes, long shadows moving as though chains trailed through the inferno, their shackles glowing white-hot. The overseer tried to fight it, driving men into the smoke with buckets, forcing them to march into choking blackness, but the fire would not be quenched. Water turned to steam before it touched the soil. The buckets cracked, their wood splitting like bones. The men staggered back, coughing, their eyes wild, and one whispered with lips cracked and bleeding, "It don't burn the crops. It burns the air." That night the fire still raged. The house itself stood untouched. Yet the fields glowed with an unnatural brilliance, as if the land itself was lit from beneath. The enslaved were not permitted rest. They were ordered to stand watch, to guard against a fire that mocked every effort to smother it. And as the hours dragged, some swore they heard cries within the flames, not human, not beast, but the deep-throated wails of earth long wounded, keening through the fire's roar. The master tried prayer, clutching a Bible with knuckles white, but the pages curled in his hands, blackening, and the words vanished into smoke before his eyes. He slammed it shut, trembling. Muttering of curses he did not believe until that night, on the third day. The fire should have exhausted itself. The sky grew dark with smoke, blotting the sun, and ash fell like snow, coating the skin, sticking in hair and mouth, but still the fire burned. Still it ate nothing, and yet consumed everything. And the enslaved noticed something. Strange, the flames seemed to follow their movement. Where they stood in clusters, the fire leaned close, flaring, bending toward them as if pulled by their breath. One man collapsed, exhausted, and the fire surged to meet him, curling around his body until he screamed. When the others dragged him back, his skin bore no burn, yet his eyes were hollow, smoke drifting out as if the fire had breathed him empty. By the week's end, no one slept. The house glowed red each night as though built inside a furnace. The master's wife wept until her voice cracked, begging to leave. But the master spat that the land was his, and fire would not chase him away. Yet he too began to tremble. Each night he woke to the smell of burning hair. Each morning he found ash prints across the floor, shaped like hands pressing upward from beneath the board's roof. Who had seen the well's eyes? Watch the fire with hollow calm, she whispered to the others. It is them, the ones who died here. They burn but are not burned. And though none dared agree aloud, all had seen what she spoke in the rolling flames. Shapes moved, shoulders bowed, wrists shackled, eyes bright as coals. They walked the fire as though it were their road, dragging chains that clanged like iron struck by hammer. The fire was their voice, their march, their vengeance. At last the master broke. He ordered the fields abandoned, his wealth left to flame. But leaving did not save him, for when he turned his horse toward the road, the fire followed. The fields did not stay contained. The flames slithered across dirt as if alive, threading their way behind him, chasing his shadow. He lashed his horse bloody, galloping, but the fire ran faster by morning. His horse returned alone, its eyes wide and rolling, its coat streaked with ash. The fire never stopped. It raged until no one dared count the days. It consumed no crop, no barn, no house, only the night, only the air, only the peace of all who lived near. And though the enslaved still labored, their bodies thin, their eyes glassy, they carried ash upon their skin like second flesh, like the hands of the dead refusing to let go. Some nights when the moon tried to pierce the haze, they swore they saw faces within the fire, not strangers, but kin, brothers, mothers, fathers lost to the soil, returned in the endless blaze, and the fire whispered in their crackling tongues, a promise that it would never fade, never be quenched, until the last debt was paid in full, and so the land bore two curses by day, the well with its eyes by night, the fire that would not burn out together. They kept the soil heavy with memory, heavy with chains that scraped still against earth no rain could cool, and when the wind shifted, carrying sparks into the house itself, the enslaved knew what was coming, for fire feeds what it touches. And this fire had not yet touched the rooms where the visitors had never left. Visitors had never left. The night grew thicker than pitch, as if the sky itself had lowered and pressed upon the land. Not a star shone. Not a breeze stirred, only silence, heavy and deliberate, like the pause before a church bell tolls at a funeral. It was in that silence that the dead gathered. The enslaved whispered of it first, not in daylight, not in the cabins where overseers might overhear, but in hushed breaths carried across fields under the veil of night. They spoke of shadows walking together, not one or two but many, too many to be counted, their outlines dragging chains that made no sound upon the soil. No one dared look too closely, for to see their faces was to recognize them. Brothers gone, mothers vanished, fathers whipped until the body broke. The covenant, they whispered, had begun. It did not form in one night but over many. Each soul wronged by lash, by hunger, by silence itself, rose in step, drawn from the soil that had drunk their blood. They moved through the fields as if patrolling them, their heads bent together, their eyes bright but dimmed from the world above. When they passed, the crops withered, turning brittle in their wake. Yet the enslaved did not fear them, for though their presence stole breath from the air, it also gave strength to weary hearts. It was said that those who heard the whispers of the covenant could endure one more lash. One more dawn, for the dead carried their pain now. The master scoffed at these tales. He dismissed the trembling lips. The hollow eyes claiming such stories were tools of control, but even he could not ignore the signs. The dogs would not enter the fields after dusk, snarling and whimpering with tails low. The horses bolted when led past the cabins, their hooves striking sparks on stone as though fleeing unseen riders. And in the house itself, prayers died in the throat, the words stolen before they left the tongue on more than one night. The master woke to find soil scattered across the floor of his chamber, heavy footprints pressed into it, too large, too many, circling his bed as if in council. He would strike the earth from the boards, curse the superstition of it. Yet by the next night the soil returned, damp and red as if freshly dug. It was Ruth again, the woman who had seen the eyes in the well, who had whispered of fire in the fields, who named it aloud. They are building, she said, her voice thin but steady. They are not wandering. They are gathering. The others hushed her, fearing the words themselves might be heard, but her truth spread, passed from lip to lip, until even the children shivered at its sound. A council of the dead, a covenant sworn not in ink or blood, but in silence and shadow. Strange things followed. The whip hung on the overseer's wall began to twitch in the night, striking the wood as if wielded by an unseen hand. The bells that called the enslaved to labor tolled without touch, their notes cracked and mournful, and in the fields, furrows opened where no plough had cut, deep, gaping lines that looked less like rows for planting than graves dug and waiting. The master tried to hold the Sabbath, forcing all into the chapel on the hill, but the air within was thick, suffocating. Every candle bent sideways, as though pressed by invisible breath. Every hymn faltered, as voices thinned to whispers. And when the master demanded the Psalms be read, the pages of the Bible blackened in his hand, curling at the edges until words became ash by then. Even he began to weaken. He drank more, slept less, muttering that he felt watched even in his own skin. He walked the halls with lantern in hand, but the lantern sputtered where shadows clustered, refusing to cast them away. And he swore that when he looked into the mirror, he saw not his own reflection, but a crowd standing behind him, faceless, countless, patient. The enslaved, meanwhile, felt a change in their own breath. They woke to find their chains lighter, not broken, but looser somehow, as though the covenant had pressed its weight against the iron. At night they heard songs rising from the soil, low, wordless, a chorus of mourning that throbbed like blood in the ears, and some claimed that when they closed their eyes, they felt hands upon their shoulders, not cruel hands, not living ones, but the touch of kin long lost, urging them to stand, to wait, to endure until the final reckoning came. The covenant grew bolder as the moon waned. The house groaned with every hour, the walls bending inward as if burdened by the weight of unseen assembly. The air was never empty. It pulsed with murmurs, fragments of speech not in English but in the tongues carried from across the sea, tongues the master had tried to beat out, tongues that refused to die. Those who heard them could not always translate, yet they understood a pact was sworn, a vengeance sealed, a judgment prepared one night. The master staggered into the courtyard, drunk with rage and fear, shouting challenges into the dark. "I own this land," he cried, voice cracking against the silence. "I own you, living or dead." But the silence did not break, it thickened. And from the field's edge, dozens of eyes opened, faint and pale. Blinking once in unison before fixing on him, he dropped his lantern, and in its dying light, he saw them, the covenant, gathered in ranks. Heads bowed not in submission but in judgment. Chains lay heavy across their shoulders, glowing faint as embers, and as the darkness folded in, their whispers rose louder now, weaving into a single voice that carried through the night. The master fled into his house, barring the door, but the whispers seeped through the cracks pressed against the shutters. Slithered beneath the floorboards, they did not shout, they did not strike, they simply waited. Their presence a weight, their silence heavier than fire, and the enslaved, watching from the cabins, knew then that the covenant of the forgotten was complete. The dead had not risen to wander. They had risen to judge. The next harvest would not belong to the living. It would belong to the covenant. And those who had fed the soil with pain would soon feed it with their own blood. Feed it with their own blood. The fields had grown strange in the final autumn. The corn no longer whispered in the wind, but seemed to mutter with the dry rasp of a dying throat. The soil beneath the villagers' feet had darkened to a near black color, not with water nor with shadow but with something thicker, something that did not reflect light but swallowed it. The villagers dared not speak of it aloud. They knew the last harvest had come at dawn. The bells rang, yet no hand touched their ropes. Their hollow toll drifted across the valley like a summons. The people gathered in silence, each clutching the tools they had inherited from their fathers, but none raised them as weapons. No, they carried them like offerings, sickles dull with rust axes, pitted with old stains, scythes worn thin by generations of use. Each family brought forth one child, too thin, too pale, too silent. The youngest always led by trembling hands. The children did not resist. They stared as if they had already seen the fate that awaited them, and had accepted it. At the edge of the field, the old stone altar had been unearthed again. The villagers had covered it many times with soil, with rubble, with barns hastily built over it. But each year, as the harvest drew near, it rose back to the surface as though the earth itself could not keep it buried. Cracks filled with moss and bone dust ran through its surface. At its center, the mark was carved deeper than the rest, a spiral that seemed to twist endlessly inward, as if it had no end. No beginning, only hunger. No priest led the rite this time. There were no priests left. Not since the night of the black rain, when the church steeple cracked open and the crucifix fell into the mire. The village elder stepped forward, his face shadowed beneath his hood. His voice rasped with the weight of centuries, yet each word carried the force of command. He spoke not in prayer, but in bargains, words older than scripture, words that tasted of blood and ash. The villagers repeated after him, voices, shaking yet bound to the ritual as a cart is bound to its wheel. Then the wind shifted and the fields bent as if bowing. Thousands of cornstalks bowed together, rustling not with the sound of leaves, but with the dry rattle of bones. From between the rose shapes emerged, too tall, too thin, their limbs bending like stalks in the breeze, their faces masked in husks, hollow eye sockets staring with patient hunger. They did not walk. They swayed forward with a rhythm like the tide. Each bore no weapon, and needed none. They had only the silence of inevitability. The children were led forward. Their parents did not weep. They did not cry out. They stood as though paralyzed by duty, though their eyes screamed louder than any throat could bear. One by one, the little ones were placed upon the altar. The spiral seemed to pulse with each small body laid across its stone, until at last the final child was placed down. The elder raised his rusted sickle and lowered it in a motion that was not his, owned guided by something vast, something older than stars. The earth shuddered. A sound rose from beneath the altar. Not the scream of the child, not the cry of the people, but a groan like mountains grinding against one another. The soil split apart, around the stone, and something vast stirred beneath. 1,000 hands of roots shot upward, curling around the altar, clutching at the sacrifice, drawing the spiral ever deeper into the earth. The husk-faced beings bowed as though in reverence. The villagers waited frozen as the altar sank inch by inch, pulled into the ground by roots black as tar, until nothing remained but churned earth. Then silence. The husk faces melted back into the fields, swaying until they vanished among the corn. The spiral was gone, but in its place the soil glistened dark and wet. The crops bent low, heavy with grain and fruit. The harvest had been given. Yet as the people turned back to their homes, the ground beneath their feet pulsed once more. A heartbeat, not of man nor beast, but of earth itself. The villagers froze. Their crops glistened with dew that was not dew but crimson. A final whisper rose from beneath the soil, carrying on the wind a voice that was neither male nor female, but ancient. The harvest is never yours, and though the fields gleamed rich with abundance, every man, woman, and child knew that what they would eat was not corn, not fruit, not grain, but the flesh of the last generation. The bells rang again at dusk, but now they told from beneath the ground the last harvest had begun.